The whole idea of owning a home being part of the American dream is that it was something you had to work towards, something you had to achieve.
Mr. Global, I generally respect your opinions and your perspectives, but you're sounding a little bootstrappy here.
The government made it to where it was no longer an achievement. The housing crash that triggered the Great Recession was a direct result of Bill Clinton's policies. 1,000%.
No, maybe 10%. Maybe. Before I get started, this is absolutely no hate to Mr. Global. I've been a fan and a follower for a long time. And while I agree a lot with what he says and his perspectives on things, there's occasionally things I disagree with as well. This particular sentiment is a super common misconception. I've gotten it in my comments a lot and been thinking about making a video on it, and now that somebody as large as Mr. Global is platforming this misconception, I figured it was time. So here we go. The Great Recession, often incorrectly referred to as the subprime mortgage crisis, happened in 2008. And this was the culmination of a perfect storm of bad financial policy and corporate greed that had been building for a long time. And while this happened at the end of the second term of Baby Bush's presidency, it's very common for people to blame it on Bill Clinton, who had not been president now for nearly a decade. He catches this blame because of one specific policy and one piece of deregulation that happened on his watch, and also because people like nice tidy things where they can point a finger and say that's the reason. But the reality is that neither that policy or that deregulation led to or caused the Great Recession. It just didn't. See, often people refer to the gutting of Glass-Steagall in the last year of Clinton's presidency as the deregulation that caused the recession. This regulation prohibited commercial banks from doing investment banking, so the company that you get your mortgage through couldn't do like Wall Street banking or speculation. And this certainly was a contributing factor to banks increasing in size, although it also was not the reason for that. And the banks increasing in size is part of why we got the whole too big to fail thing. And I agree it was a bad thing to deregulate, but it didn't cause the recession. See, with the exception of Citigroup, most of the large banks that failed were not commercial banks. They were pure investment banks. Glass-Steagall did not affect those banks' lending practices at all. So you could say it maybe contributed to making the recession worse, but it didn't cause it. And then there's the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, which is what it appears that Mr. Global is referring to in his video. Now, the CRA was actually a Carter-era policy that Clinton revised. And this was the act that was designed to help lower-income people get into houses. A policy that Mr. Global is alluding that people didn't have to work for their houses anymore because the government just gave it to them. And this is where the myth of the subprime mortgage crisis comes in. We created a policy that made it easy for people who couldn't afford houses to buy houses, and then obviously they defaulted on all of their loans and ruined the economy. And while Mr. Global in his video asserts that he believes that it was the government's fault who did this, which I completely agree, he's still ultimately saying that it was poor people not paying their mortgages, and that's bullshit. There was no explosion of low-income homeownership rates during the housing bubble. In fact, homeownership rates among the poorest 20% of Americans actually fell during that time period. And default rates among low-income, high-risk borrowers didn't increase. The irony is that Mr. Global hits the nail on the head while missing the point when describing who was defaulting on these loans by explaining his own personal experience. He explained that he bought a house that he had no business buying and could barely afford. And while he was lucky enough to work through it and not default, many weren't. But being a white middle-class man, the CRA was not the reason you got that loan. And the people buying shit they couldn't afford was not subprime lenders, it was middle and upper middle class families buying bigger houses than they needed or investment properties. And that had absolutely nothing to do with the CRA or Glass-Steagall. But it absolutely did have something to do with deregulation, just not really deregulation that happened under Clinton. Now when it comes to guessing why anything is wrong in the world today, any fool knows there's always one safe place to make that bet. And once again, our resident supervillain doesn't disappoint because this is, in large part, Ronald Reagan's fault. Hell, it could even be another reason everybody hates Reagan. One of the very first things Ronald Reagan did was pass the Depository Institution Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980. This basically said fuck antitrust laws in the financial industry and allowed big banks to do big mergers, and it deregulated interest rates, allowing banks to charge whatever interest rates they wanted. You know what happens when banks can charge whatever interest rates they want? They start subprime lending, because lending to high-risk borrowers gets more appealing when you can charge whatever interest rate you want. It was also predatory, but you know, Reagan was notorious for fucking poor people and not in the fun way. And then in 1986, he made the problem worse by getting rid of the consumer interest tax deduction, but keeping mortgage interest tax deductible. So now, instead of people searching to get personal loans for when they needed some extra money, they started cashing out on home equity, which increased the amount of people money were borrowing against their houses. You can see how that could maybe have some problems. Then we can go back to Nixon and start blaming some of this on him because it was under him that mortgage-backed securities became a thing. Mortgage-backed securities allowed banks to pool mortgages and allowed investors to buy into those mortgages. And it was an evolution of this policy specifically that would end up making the Great Recession so great. And one such evolution is where the Federal Reserve under Clinton deserves a little bit more of the blame. Because in 1996, the Fed started allowing banks to use credit default swaps as a substitute for bank capital. This made banks more vulnerable to failure because they had less capital. However, in 1996, the situations that they were allowed to do this in were incredibly limited. But banks are sneaky, tricky little bastards. Over the next few years, they started using CDSs and CDOs and mortgage-backed securities and a bunch of other things that are just named with 3 letters that we'll never understand the meanings of to make lending practices way more complicated. And by 2004, regulators kind of realized that, oh, this could be a problem. Because we don't really know what's going on with all that they're doing because they've made it really fucking complicated. But by 2004, we had the decider in office. And he made the decider that we didn't need no more regulation. In fact, you know what we need? A little less. And by that, I mean a lot less. Because the SEC, instead of regulating them some more, decided that they could regulate themselves and decide how much capital that they needed to have on hand by creating their own risk models. Yeah, you want to look for some direct correlations between government policy and the Great Recession? That's a pretty good one right there. But what else was going on during Baby Bush's first term? There was some massive tax cuts to the rich on things like capital gains, making investment banks way more likely to invest in things like real estate if they don't have to pay all the taxes on the capital gains from selling it. If that wasn't enough incentive, the Fed also slashed interest rates down to 1%. And they conveniently stayed below 2% through Baby Bush's re-election. And now I suppose those decisions had everything to do with strong economic policy, and nothing to do with the complete coincidence that the chair of the Fed, Alan Greenspan, was a self-described libertarian Republican who was nominated to an unprecedented 5th term by George Bush. Nothing to see here, folks. So the low interest rates coupled with massive tax cuts resulted in house prices doubling while Bush was in office. So people started heavily speculating and investing in real estate because it was a casino you couldn't lose at, right? Until you could. So while both wealthy and upper middle class investors are buying houses they couldn't afford because, you just can't lose, banks devised a great way to get in on the action without assuming the risk, or so they thought. You know those mortgage-backed securities we talked about earlier? Those got deregulated too, and now they were able to start hiding these really high-risk loans in these securities. Then they could sell them off knowing they were going to default, but hey, not my problem anymore. And they were selling them to other banks, and they were selling them to pension funds and retirement funds and things like that around the world. And then the bubble bursts. And all of these white, middle-class, over-leveraged families who, didn't work for their homes, as you put it, started defaulting. And these big banks didn't have the capital to cover the defaults because Bush didn't think it was necessary for them to have that. And these loans, which these banks had hidden in these mortgage-backed securities and sold around the globe, had now permeated every aspect of the global market. And as they failed, Grandpa lost his pension, Dad lost his 401k, you lost your job and your house. Then the too big to fail banks failed from the mess that they themselves caused. The big banks bailed out of the Boeing with their golden parachutes while we were left to ride out the rest of the flight. And isn't that a perfect analogy for this? Because Boeing's crashing and burning are also a lack of government oversight and corporate greed. But anyway, landing my plane of a video, if we're really divvying out blame for the Great Recession, nothing directly leads back to Clinton. A little bit of the blame goes to Nixon, a little bit more blame goes to Clinton, but direct responsibility falls squarely on the shoulders of Reagan, Bush, and the banking industry. And there's no two ways about that.